Governments often claim that they are working for your financial freedom. They speak about stability, economic growth, and new opportunities. But if you look more carefully at history, a very different picture begins to appear. For centuries, many governments have slowly eroded the wealth of ordinary people while concentrating power and prosperity around themselves. And most of the time they have done this not openly, but through complex and often invisible financial mechanisms. What's interesting is that these methods are not new. Throughout history, the same tactics have been used again and again under different names and within different systems. The packaging changes, the language changes, but the underlying goal often remains the same: to move wealth upward while keeping the majority dependent on the system. One of the oldest and simplest tools in this story is inflation. When a government spends more money than it collects in taxes, it faces two options. It can openly admit the problem and raise taxes on its citizens, which is politically risky, or it can quietly reduce the value of money itself. In other words, it can weaken the purchasing power of the currency in circulation. One of the most well-known examples of this happened in ancient Rome. During the 3rd century, when the empire faced rising military expenses, Roman emperors began reducing the amount of precious metal in the silver coin known as the denarius. What had once been nearly pure silver gradually became mostly copper, covered only with a thin layer of silver. The state continued to claim that the coin held the same value. But in reality, anyone holding that money was unknowingly becoming poorer. Prices began to rise rapidly. Savings lost their value. Wages struggled to keep up. In effect, this functioned like an invisible tax on the population. Today, the same principle still exists. The difference is that instead of imperial mints, we now have central banks. By the Middle Ages, a different version of this financial strategy appeared: forced loans. In countries like England, France, and Spain, monarchs would often pressure wealthy merchants and guilds to lend money to the crown. These loans were rarely voluntary. Refusing could mean heavy fines, confiscation of property, or even imprisonment. Kings frequently promised repayment with interest, but payments were often delayed, repaid with devalued currency, or sometimes never repaid at all. While the state continued funding wars and maintaining royal courts, merchants risked losing their capital. The success of this method relied on a psychological trick. These forced loans were often framed as acts of patriotism or civic duty. By the 17th century, the financial world had grown more complex, and the system itself became a new tool. When the Bank of England was established in 1694, the primary reason was to finance England's wars with France. Wealthy investors purchased government bonds. In return, the state promised regular interest payments funded by taxes. On the surface, this arrangement seemed reasonable. But an important question remained: who was paying those taxes? The answer was largely ordinary people. Taxes on basic goods such as salt, beer, and cloth fell heavily on the population. As a result, wealthy investors earned secure returns by lending money to the state, while the broader public indirectly financed those returns. In essence, this was a wealth transfer mechanism disguised as national finance. And the model still exists in modern economies. Even today, government bonds are considered among the safest investments in the world, largely because they are backed by the productive capacity and taxes of society. In the modern era, however, these mechanisms have become far more complex. Take budget deficits, for example. Many governments accumulate enormous debts and finance them by issuing bonds in financial markets. These bonds are purchased by investors, banks, and even foreign governments. Politicians often present this borrowing as necessary for infrastructure projects, job creation, or social programs. But in reality, a significant portion of the money can flow toward military spending, corporate subsidies, or financial bailouts. When the time comes to repay these debts, governments rarely cut the highest levels of spending. Instead, they may raise taxes, expand the money supply, or reduce social programs. As a result, the debt may appear to be taken on for the benefit of society, but the burden falls largely on the public while financial investors receive the returns. One of the clearest examples of this dynamic occurred during the global financial crisis of 2008. Major banks had taken excessive risks and created complex financial products tied to unstable mortgage markets. When the system approached collapse, governments stepped in with massive bailout packages. Much of that money ultimately came from taxpayers. In the aftermath of the crisis, many of those same banks became even larger and more concentrated within the financial system. The situation is often summarized with a simple phrase: profits are privatized, while losses are socialized. A similar pattern can also be seen in pension systems. In countries such as the United States, Britain, and across Europe, millions of people contribute to government retirement programs throughout their working lives. Most assume that this money is being saved for their future. But in many cases, the funds collected are not actually stored. Governments often spend the money immediately and leave accounting promises for future payments. This means the sustainability of the system depends heavily on future taxpayers. When populations age and the number of workers declines, the system begins to strain. Governments often respond by raising retirement ages or reducing the real value of benefits. Across all these examples, one theme repeatedly appears: perception management. Inflation is described as growth. Borrowing is presented as investment. Bailouts are framed as necessary for stability. Pension cuts are called reforms. The language changes, but the underlying reality often does not. In many cases, wealth gradually flows from the bottom upward. In recent decades, these dynamics have grown even more complex. For instance, central banks introduced policies known as quantitative easing, injecting trillions of dollars into financial markets. These measures were intended to stabilize the financial system, and in many ways they succeeded. But they also drove the prices of assets such as stocks and real estate sharply higher. And most of those assets were already owned by the wealthiest segments of society. As a result, asset holders saw significant gains while the cost of living continued to rise for many households. Another modern mechanism is stealth taxation. Instead of directly increasing income taxes, governments sometimes rely on indirect taxes and inflation. When prices rise faster than wages, purchasing power declines. This effectively acts as a hidden tax. People may feel as if they are earning more, but in reality they can afford less. History teaches us an important lesson. These mechanisms tend to reappear in different forms across different eras. When Roman currency was debased, citizens suffered. When medieval rulers imposed forced loans, merchants lost wealth. In modern economies, inflation and debt can produce similar effects. Different eras, similar dynamics. Perhaps the most striking fact is that many people remain unaware that these processes are happening. Inflation is often seen as natural. Taxes are accepted as inevitable. Bailouts are viewed as unavoidable economic measures. This is why financial knowledge and economic history are so important. Understanding the past helps us better interpret the present. Because societies that fail to understand history often find themselves repeating the same cycles.